So I want you to imagine looking at a photograph in a bookstore.
Okay. Setting a scene.
Yeah, exactly. It's this old black and white print of a young family, a mother, a father, two little kids, and they're just happily riding their bikes through the sand dunes.
Sounds idyllic.
Right. The weather looks beautiful. They look completely at peace. But there's a catch.
There always is.
The date scrawled on the back of the photo is April 1940, and they are in the Netherlands.
Oh, wow. Okay. So just a month before the invasion.
Exactly. A month later, their entire country would be invaded, and their whole world would basically burn down. And today, we are taking a deep dive into the mind of a man who believes that you and I are currently, right now, riding our bikes on that exact same beach.
Blissfully ignoring the storm that's already here.
Yep, blissfully ignoring World War III.
It's a profoundly unsettling image to start with, because it really forces you to question your immediate reality. Like if the sky is blue today, does that mean the storm isn't already miles inland?
That is the exact cognitive dissonance we're unpacking today on the deep dive. We're looking at this sweeping, really provocative YouTube interview from the channel Brainwave. It's episode 47.
Right.
The host, Bram Bosson, sits down with a guest named Flipse. And in this single conversation, they somehow weave together European economic collapse, apocalyptic religious prophecy, the Israel-Gaza conflict, and this whole idea of needing to start building an ark.
Which is quite the lineup for one conversation.
It's massive. It's kind of like sitting in a comfortably air-conditioned room while someone is aggressively trying to convince you the building is structurally collapsing around you. The temperature feels totally fine, but they're telling you the foundational pillars are cracking.
Before we go any further, though,
Yeah.
I think we really need to set some ground rules for how we are approaching this.
Yes, absolutely. Good call.
Because the source material we are working with today contains highly polarized, very politically charged, and extremely controversial viewpoints on global conflicts, domestic policies, religion, history, pretty much everything.
Every third-rail topic you can think of.
Exactly. So our role here today is not to endorse any of these views, nor is it to condemn them. We aren't here to say, he's right about this or he's completely wrong about that. Our objective is strictly analytical.
We're just looking at the blueprints.
Right. We want to understand the architecture of Flipse's specific worldview. Like, how does a person connect a lost factory job in Germany to ancient biblical prophecy?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand that architecture, we really have to start with that foundational pillar he lays down. The idea that society is already collapsing, but the masses are just oblivious.
Right.
He doesn't describe modern Europe as this thriving, dynamic place. He actually calls it a somber, open-air museum.
That phrase alone carries so much weight. Because, an open-air museum is a place of preservation, right?
Yeah, totally.
It implies that the structure is intact, the monuments are beautiful, you can walk the cobblestone streets. But the vitality, the actual living, breathing future of the civilization, that's dead. You're just touring the remnants of a past golden age.
And he grounds this feeling in that April 1940 photograph we talked about. Because to him, the Second World War had already been raging for months by then, right? Poland was devastated, the Sudetenland was occupied.
But to that Dutch family on their bikes, the war was just like a headline in a newspaper. It was far away.
Exactly. They had no idea the storm had breached the perimeter, and Flipse argues we are in that exact moment right now. He claims a Third World War has effectively already started, and he points to the West's proxy war with Russia and Ukraine as proof.
Right, because thousands are dying, billions in weapons are flowing.
But because we're sitting on our patios enjoying a coffee, we think we're at peace.
He's really tapping into a well-documented psychological mechanism here called normalcy bias.
Oh, what is that exactly?
It's the brain's tendency to disbelieve or minimize threat warnings. Basically, we assume that since a disaster hasn't happened to us recently, it's not going to happen to us now. The brain literally struggles to comprehend a disaster that hasn't breached your immediate physical space.
Okay, but I have to push back on his diagnosis just a bit here. Like, couldn't Flipse be suffering from the exact opposite psychological trap? Something like an availability cascade.
How do you mean?
Well, he's consuming so much doom-scrolling media, constantly looking at geopolitical flashpoints, that he perceives a localized conflict or a temporary economic dip as the end of the world. Like, if you only look at fires, you start to think the whole world is burning.
That is a really fair counterargument. Is it normalcy bias blinding the public? Or is it hypervigilance distorting his reality?
Right.
I think the difference often comes down to systemic risk versus localized risk. Flipse would argue he isn't just looking at isolated fires.
Hmm.
He's looking at the structural integrity of the global economy and seeing fundamental decay.
He does contrast this complacency in Western Europe with the rapid growth he sees in places like Poland or further east in China and India.
Yeah, claiming those places have a hunger and momentum that the West has just completely lost.
Which raises this exhausting proposition for you as the listener. If you truly believe it's April 1940 right now, how do you even function? I mean, can you live a normal life while remaining hyper-vigilant to global collapse?
That's a lot of pressure.
It is. If the building is on fire but the AC is running, do you just sit there and sweat in anticipation?
Well, you can't just sit there. The psychological toll of passive dread is way too high. If you believe the storm is here, you have to take action. Which brings us to his central survival mechanism. You have to build an ark.
Ah, the Ark. He leans heavily into the biblical analogy of Noah here. Noah spent 120 years building this massive wooden ark on dry land.
And he was mocked by everyone around him.
Exactly. He looked like an absolute lunatic right up until the sky opened up.
What's fascinating here is how he also anchors this concept with a quote from Warren Buffett, actually.
Wait, really? Warren Buffett talks about building arks.
Yeah, Buffett has used the building an ark metaphor in a financial context regarding preparedness. So it's a brilliant rhetorical move by Flipse. He takes this deeply theological, ancient story and merges it with modern, pragmatic financial advice.
But his ark isn't a boat.
No.
It's a really specific, multifaceted strategy. He breaks it down into different categories, starting with the financial arc. And he doesn't just say, like, save money.
No, it's much more active than that.
He advises holding physical cash, acquiring Bitcoin, and keeping precious metals like gold and silver. But he specifically notes you should hold these in different currencies. Why the emphasis on different currencies if the whole system is supposedly crashing?
Because he is hedging against a localized fiat currency collapse. If you hold all your wealth in euros, and the European Central Bank introduces policies that hyperinflate the euro, your wealth just evaporates.
Gone.
Right. But if you diversify into US dollars, Swiss francs, Bitcoin, physical gold, you're creating financial bulkheads. If one compartment floods, the ship doesn't sink.
So it's extreme diversification driven by a total lack of faith in central banking.
Exactly. And he pairs that with a physical arc.
Right, the survival gear. He talks about water filters, noting you can only survive a few days without water, stocking up on food, installing solar panels, buying home batteries and generators.
He's predicting massive grid failures.
Yeah, he claims that if the power grid goes down for 2 days, you get localized panic. But if it's down for a week, society is effectively gone.
And I want to look at the psychology of this preparation for a second. When you are confronted with these massive macro events, geopolitical wars, inflation, you feel entirely helpless.
Totally out of control.
And that helplessness generates immense paralyzing anxiety. But micro actions, researching a water filter, installing a solar panel, stacking a few silver coins, these are tactile, controllable things. They provide a psychological anchor in a very chaotic world.
I see the logic there for sure. But it still sounds incredibly isolating. I mean, when I picture a doomsday prepper, I picture a guy in a camo jacket sitting in an underground bunker in the woods, aiming a shotgun at anyone who comes near his canned beans.
And that is exactly where Flipse diverges from the standard prepper trope. He vehemently pushes back against that lone wolf mentality.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he argues that the coming storm is going to be far too severe for a single family to weather alone.
I think he literally says if you try to build it alone, you're just building a raft, not an ark.
Precisely. A raft capsizes in a hurricane. To build an ark, you need a community. You need to gather specialists.
Like who?
Like a farmer, a mechanic, a medic. People with different skills who share a mutual understanding of the threat. It is a collaborative, highly social approach to surviving an apocalypse. He is advocating for parallel societies, not isolated bunkers.
Okay, so if he's spending this much time, money, and social capital building a metaphorical ark, we have to ask what exactly he believes is causing the flood. Like, the storm doesn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, it doesn't.
No.
And Flipse points a very direct finger at economic and environmental policies as the primary catalysts for this collapse.
He views the economy as the fundamental bedrock of human behavior. If the economy cracks, morality, peace, and social order immediately follow it right into the abyss.
He shares this fascinating story about a macroeconomist he knows, referred to as Magic, who fled the war in Bosnia. Flipse asked him how a modern, seemingly functional country like Yugoslavia could just tear itself apart so rapidly and violently.
Because we usually hear that war explained purely through the lens of ancient ethnic and religious hatreds just boiling over.
Right, but Magid told him the Oorknal, the Dutch word for the Big Bang, wasn't ethnic tension. It was economic. It was massive stagnation, skyrocketing unemployment, and hyperinflation.
Let's break down how that mechanism actually works, because it's so crucial to Flips's worldview. How does inflation actually turn neighbors into enemies?
Think about what money actually is,
Yeah.
fundamentally. Money is a system of trust. It allows a baker to trade with a mechanic without having to physically barter a loaf of bread for an oil change.
Right.
When hyperinflation hits, that universal system of trust dissolves. Your savings are wiped out. Your salary can't buy food. Suddenly, you are thrust back into a tribal survival state. You only trust your immediate in-group.
So your family, your ethnic group, your religious community.
Exactly. When the economic pie shrinks to starvation levels, competition for resources becomes violent. Flipse compares it directly to the Great Depression of the 1930s, paving the runway for the extreme political shifts that caused World War II.
And he's looking at modern Europe, specifically Germany, and seeing those exact same warning lights flashing on the dashboard. He cites a terrifying metric. He claims 600,000 jobs have been lost in Germany recently.
It's a staggering number.
It is. And when you hear a number like that on the news, it's just a statistic. But he emphasizes the cascading human element of that destruction.
A factory closing doesn't just impact the line worker. It impacts their spouse, their children's ability to go to a good school, the local grocery store they shop at, the restaurants in the town. You're talking about a localized economic contagion.
And who does he blame for this industrial implosion? Because he doesn't blame natural market cycles. He blames ideological left-wing policies, specifically the European Green Deal.
He argues that these sweeping environmental policies are essentially an economic suicide pact for Western industry.
Wow, suicide pact.
Yes. He views them not as necessary science-based steps to save the planetary climate, but as destructive, ideologically driven agendas that completely ignore the realities of thermodynamics and economics.
He uses a very specific contrast to illustrate this, actually. He compares Germany's energy policy to countries like France and Finland. While France and Finland maintained or built nuclear power plants to ensure a stable, affordable 2047 energy baseline, Germany made the political decision to shut their nuclear plants down.
Which forces a reliance on a mix of intermittent renewables, like wind and solar, and imported energy.
Right.
Flipse's argument here is very mechanical. He says you simply cannot run a heavy, industrialized, manufacturing-based economy, which Germany is on expensive, unstable energy. If the energy input costs double, the factories have to shut down or move to a country with cheaper energy, like China or the U.S.
He compounds this by ripping into the economic sanctions placed on Russia over the war in Ukraine. He asserts that economic sanctions almost never achieve their geopolitical goals. Instead, they just backfire on the citizens.
And in this case, he claims the sanctions only resulted in the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines and astronomically high energy costs for European families and businesses.
Notice how he links the macro to the micro here. A lost job in a German steel mill isn't just bad luck or bad quarter for the company. To Flipse, it is the direct, calculated result of international climate accords and geopolitical posturing in Brussels and Washington.
The air conditioner in the room is still blowing cold air, but the power plant supplying the electricity is being systematically dismantled.
That's the perfect way to phrase it. But the economic fragility is only half of the equation for him. A country can survive an economic downturn if its social fabric is tight. But Flipse believes that the social fabric is being deliberately shredded by massive demographic shifts.
He points directly to the loss of national borders, specifically the Schengen Agreement.
So for listeners who might not be deeply familiar with European border policy, the Schengen Agreement, which was signed in the town of Schengen in Luxembourg, essentially abolished internal border checks across much of the European Union.
Right. It allows for the free movement of goods, services, and people.
Right.
It is arguably the most defining, foundational pillar of the modern European project.
And Flipse shares a story about visiting that exact town about 15 years ago. He went to the information center, saw the commemorative uniforms, read the treaties celebrating this open border, and he had a visceral physical reaction. He literally broke down in tears of sheer anger.
His wife had to pull him aside and tell him to calm down.
Right. Yeah. Why would a bureaucratic treaty provoke a reaction that's usually reserved for, like, personal tragedy.
It comes down to the metaphor he uses to understand a border.
Yeah.
I want to highlight this because rhetorically, it is incredibly effective, regardless of whether you agree with him.
Right.
He doesn't talk about Schengen as a macroeconomic labor policy. He compares it to the front door of your house. He says, imagine leaving your front door wide open and telling anyone walking down the street, come on in, take my food, sleep in my bed, here are my wife and kids, take what you want, and you don't even have to contribute to the household.
By shrinking a complex geopolitical treaty involving hundreds of millions of people into the most intimate, localized space imaginable, the family home, he reframes the debate entirely.
Completely. Any uncontrolled border crossing isn't a migration trend anymore. It feels like a personal home invasion.
And because of this open door, he claims Western cities have lost control. He bluntly calls them shitholes. He points to rising social tensions, citing a civil war in Ireland over migrant accommodations. He points to the construction of 2,600 mosques in Germany as proof of what he terms rampant Islamization of a historically Judeo-Christian continent.
We have to pause here and contextualize his framework, because it operates on a completely different frequency than mainstream political discourse.
Right, how so?
In Flipse's worldview, there is virtually zero room for this standard humanitarian narrative regarding migration.
Yeah, if you watch mainstream news, migration is framed as a human rights issue. People are fleeing war, famine, or persecution. They are refugees seeking safety.
Flipse entirely dismisses that framing. He asserts that the vast majority of arrivals are not true refugees fleeing immediate violence, but economic migrants seeking a better standard of living.
Interestingly, he says he doesn't actually blame the migrants themselves for trying to improve their lives.
No, he blames the system. He views the European political and financial system that incentivizes and allows this movement as deeply corrupt.
He calls it a business model. He claims that housing and processing migrants has become a massive profit center for governments, NGOs, and the hotel industry. So for him, it's not an act of international charity or human rights. It's a lucrative financial scheme that has the secondary effect of diluting and destroying the cultural identity of Europe.
So if you follow his logic, European governments are actively destroying their own industrial economies with the Green Deal, and they are actively destroying their social cohesion with open borders.
Which leads to the natural screaming question that the interviewer, Bram, asks. Why? If these policies are so obviously destructive to the host nations, why are elected officials pursuing them so aggressively?
And this is the moment in the interview where the scope of his worldview radically expands. This is where he claims that none of this is accidental incompetence. It is entirely diabolically intentional.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He makes the leap from standard, albeit harsh, conservative political critique right into the realm of grand conspiracy. He points to things like Agenda 2030, Agenda 21, and the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
Just to clarify for the listener, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are international frameworks aimed at reducing global poverty, improving healthcare access, and mitigating climate change. They are presented as a collective, humanitarian roadmap for the future.
But when most people hear about UN sustainability goals, they think of like corporate boilerplate, recycling targets, carbon offsets. Why does Flipse look at that and see a sinister plot? How does he get from a climate pledge to a new world order?
It comes down to the mechanics of tracking and enforcement. If a global body is going to enforce sustainability, they have to track it.
Right.
That requires massive centralization of data. ESG scores for companies, carbon footprint tracking for individuals, digital IDs to monitor consumption. Flipse views this not as environmental stewardship, but as the construction of a digital panopticon. Yes, and he claims there is a tiny, incredibly powerful global elite driving this centralization.
And he names names. He mentions the Rothschild family, the World Economic Forum, politicians like former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, and the massive asset management firm BlackRock.
BlackRock is a fascinating inclusion here. They manage trillions of dollars in retirement and investment funds globally. Because they hold so much capital, they can exert immense pressure on corporate boards to adopt these ESG environmental, social, and governance policies.
So Flipse is forming a unified theory of global control by linking modern corporate entities like BlackRock with historical banking dynasties like the Rothschilds.
Exactly. He believes their ultimate goal is total centralization. A single global political system, a single financial system, and a single religious power. He views sovereign nations as mere puppets acting out a script written by an unelected transnational cabal.
And then he takes it one step further, a step that moves the conversation out of geopolitics entirely. He labels this elite group as literal Satan worshippers.
This is a massive rhetorical escalation. We are no longer talking about greedy billionaires or corrupt politicians trying to manipulate tax codes. We have moved into the realm of the supernatural.
Exactly. The mention of Satan worshippers isn't a colorful metaphor to emphasize their greed. It is his literal theological worldview. He believes that the entirety of human history, from ancient times to modern boardrooms, is an active, ongoing battle between God and Satan.
He views all the geopolitical events we've discussed, the collapse of the economy, the erasure of borders, the UN climate agendas, as mere surface-level symptoms of a much deeper spiritual war taking place in heavenly places.
He specifically references the end times, as described in the biblical book of Revelation.
Right. He posits that humanity's fatal flaw throughout history is arrogance, the arrogance of acting like gods.
And he specifically ties this back to the climate debate. He says humans are so hubristic that they think they can control the weather, that they can manage the climate of the earth, instead of submitting to the ultimate authority, which he defines as the God of Israel.
This is a profound shift in perspective, and it fundamentally alters how a person interacts with reality. If you view global geopolitics through the lens of apocalyptic literature, your entire risk assessment changes.
Walk me through that. Like, how does believing in the book of Revelation change how you view a UN climate summit?
Think about the premise of political reform. If you believe the world's problems are caused by bad policy or corrupt politicians, your response is to try and fix the system.
Right. You vote for a new candidate, you organize a protest, you try to pass new legislation.
Exactly. You believe the ship can be steered away from the iceberg. But if you believe that a total global reset, a period of immense tribulation, war, and destruction, is not only inevitable but divinely ordained and prophesied in ancient texts, then political systems cannot be fixed.
They are supposed to fail.
Yes, the iceberg is part of the divine plan. You don't try to steer the ship, you just build a lifeboat. You build an ark to survive the judgment.
That perfectly explains his entire prepper mentality. You can't vote your way out of a divine apocalypse.
No, you can't.
And the interviewer, Bram, provides an interesting skeptical counterweight here. Bram shares a contrasting, much more secular view. He flat out asks Flipse for proof of God.
Right.
Bram mentions a previous guest he had on the show, Bart Brands, who lives with absolute certainty of the afterlife. And Bram notes how deeply that certainty seems to calm people. He wants to know how to get that certainty.
Bram is approaching faith like a scientist looking for empirical data. Show me the proof, and I will adopt the belief.
But Flipse's response bypasses intellect and goes straight to the experiential. He advises Bram to simply pray, to ask questions out loud into the void, and wait for answers. He describes his relationship with God as having a super good friend you can talk to at any moment of the day.
But because Flipse's worldview is so deeply anchored in this specific literal theology, it dictates his views on geography as well.
Right. He believes that because of the spiritual war, the entire globe revolves around a single small piece of land, Israel, and specifically the city of Jerusalem.
Geopolitically, it is a tiny sliver of the Middle East. But theologically, he notes that the three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, all trace their roots back to the patriarch Abraham and all revere Jerusalem.
And therefore, to Flipse, it is not just a disputed territory. It is the literal center of gravity for the world's spiritual and physical conflict.
Which brings us to the most intense, contentious part of the source material, the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Yeah.
Because Flipse views Israel as the theological and historical center of the world, his stance on the current conflict is absolute. There is zero gray area. And this is where we see Bram forcefully push back.
This segment of their conversation is a perfect microscopic case study of the modern media landscape. You have two intelligent people looking at the exact same geographic conflict, operating in the exact same time period, and seeing two completely incompatible realities.
They have no shared vocabulary to even debate the issue.
Let's lay out Flipse's position first. He vehemently denies that a Palestinian state ever existed historically. He describes the region prior to the modern state of Israel as a barren, empty wasteland that was only developed, cultivated, and civilized once Jewish people returned and built it up.
He dismisses the concept of a unique Palestinian national or ethnic identity entirely, viewing it as a modern political fiction created solely to oppose Israel.
Furthermore, when discussing the current devastating war in Gaza, he justifies the total destruction of the infrastructure. He makes a shocking, sweeping claim. He states that 97% of the population in Gaza are terrorists.
He argues that they have been systematically fed anti-Semitic hate and indoctrinated through their schools and media since birth.
He also outright denies the widespread international reports of starvation in Gaza. He calls the idea of famine a flagrant lie and claims that Israel is actually tiptoeing militarily, acting with extreme caution, while simultaneously losing a massive global propaganda war.
He also brings up the tragedy of October 7th to highlight a specific point about betrayal and the impossibility of peace.
Right. He notes that many of the Israelis living in the kibbutzim near the Gaza border, the people who were explicitly targeted, tortured, and murdered, were secular, pro-peace, left-leaning individuals.
They were the very people advocating for a two-state solution. They often employed Gazans, drove them to Israeli hospitals for treatment, and broke bread with them for decades.
To Flipse, the fact that these specific people were targeted proves that peace is structurally impossible, because the hatred is too deeply ingrained to be overcome by diplomacy or kindness.
Now, as analysts, we have to look at how Bram Bosson reacts to this barrage of absolutism, because Bram does not just nod along and let it slide. He firmly and repeatedly challenges Flipse on almost every single point.
Bram brings an entirely different epistemological framework to the table. He cites a friend who recently traveled to the region to make an on-the-ground documentary, speaking directly to politicians and soldiers.
And Bram brings up the visceral, raw footage he's seen on TikTok, showing starving civilians, bloodied children, and completely pulverized neighborhoods.
He even points out that staunch conservative commentators in America, like Charlie Kirk, have started shifting their opinions based on the sheer, unavoidable scale of the violence and destruction. Bram suggests that what is happening could legitimately be classified as a genocide of innocent children.
The disconnect between them is staggering. Bram is appealing to universal humanitarianism. He's looking at individual suffering, the starving children, the raw videos of destruction on social media.
His framework is based on the universally accepted idea that killing children is wrong, regardless of the historical claims to the land or the geopolitical context.
But Flipse is appealing to absolute historical and theological definitions. In his framework, he isn't looking at a group of struggling civilians caught in a tragic crossfire. He is looking at a population fundamentally compromised by a deep spiritual and systemic hatred.
Therefore, the humanitarian lens Bram is using simply doesn't compute for Flipse. It bounces right off his theological armor.
You have one person getting their reality from ground-level social media algorithms and humanitarian documentaries, and another filtering their reality through ancient prophecies and a belief in a localized divine mandate.
They are just shouting across a chasm.
Exactly.
So if we pull back from the Middle East and return to Europe, Flipse believes that the same elite forces driving the chaos globally are rapidly tightening their control mechanisms at home. He believes they are actively dismantling what he calls the 3 V's.
Ah, the 3 V's. In Dutch, that stands for vrijheid, veiligheid, and vermogen. Freedom, security, and wealth. He sees these 3 core pillars of a stable, middle-class life being systematically destroyed.
Let's start with vrijheid, or freedom. His biggest fear here revolves around a very specific piece of financial technology, CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies. He warns that these digital euros, especially when eventually linked to European digital IDs, will create a literal financial prison.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is a fear we are seeing crop up more and more frequently in discussions about the digitization of the economy. We really need to explain what a CBDC actually is, mechanically, to understand his terror.
Right, because most people think, I already use Apple Pay, I already tap my debit card, my money's already digital. What's the difference?
The difference is programmability and centralization. When you use Apple Pay, you are using a digital interface to access traditional fiat currency held by a commercial bank.
Okay.
A central bank digital currency is issued directly by the central bank, bypassing commercial banks entirely. And more importantly, it is programmable money.
Meaning the issuer can set conditions on how it is spent.
Exactly.
Flipse argues that if your money is programmable and centrally controlled, the government can freeze your assets arbitrarily. Like if you attend an unsanctioned protest, if you exceed your monthly carbon allowance by buying too much meat, or even if you just trigger an algorithm by spending money in a way they deem suspicious, they can lock you out of your own wallet with a keystroke.
You can't buy food. You can't buy a train ticket. You are effectively erased from society. He compares this directly to George Orwell's 1984, to Animal Farm, and to the social credit system currently operating in China, where millions of people have been denied the ability to purchase travel tickets due to low social credit scores. Even if you don't buy into his grand satanic conspiracy, that underlying technological fear is totally valid. The transition to a cashless, digitally tracked society inherently removes the veil of privacy. It creates an infrastructure where total, granular control is technically possible. And for someone who values autonomy, the mere existence of that infrastructure is terrifying.
Then he moves to the second V, Velikide, or security. He claims that the social contract has broken down, that police can no longer protect citizens, and that the streets are increasingly ruled by unchecked crime and aggression.
The state has surrendered its monopoly on violence, essentially.
Right. And finally, Vermeulen, wealth. He rails against the Dutch tax system. Now, every conservative complains about taxes, but he takes specific aim at something called the Box 3 wealth tax. How does this tax actually work, and why is it the final straw for him?
The Dutch Box 3 tax is highly controversial. Historically, instead of taxing the actual return you made on your savings and investments, like a standard capital gains tax, the government assumed a fictitious rate of return based on the total value of your assets and taxed you on that assumption.
Wait. So if I had a bad year in the stock market and actually lost money, or if my savings account paid 0% interest, the government would still tax me as if I had made like a 4% profit.
Exactly. You are paying taxes on money you never actually made.
That's wild.
It has been heavily litigated and is undergoing reform, but for entrepreneurs like Flipse, it represents a predatory state that is actively punishing success and slowly confiscating wealth. He claims this relentless taxation and crushing bureaucracy are hollowing out the economic core of the Netherlands, driving the wealth creators away.
So if we look at his scoreboard, his money isn't safe from a predatory taxman, his physical person isn't safe from street crime, and his freedom of movement and speech is threatened by programmable digital currencies.
Which pushes him to a drastic, life-altering decision. Flipse feels so strongly about the loss of these three Vs and what he perceives as a massive, dangerous rise in anti-Semitism that he is actively fleeing his home country of the Netherlands.
He views the Netherlands not just as a failing state, but as the tip of the spear. He calls it the most extreme country in Europe, the testing ground for all of Brussels' evil policies.
If the EU wants to try out a new draconian environmental restriction or a new digital control grid, he believes they test it on the compliant Dutch population first.
But his critique of the Netherlands goes much deeper than current EU policy. He digs into history to assert that the country is deeply, historically, and fundamentally anti-Semitic.
He points back to World War II, noting a devastating and often overlooked statistic that the Dutch deported the highest percentage of Jews in Western Europe.
He emphasizes that Camp Westerbork, the primary transit camp in the Netherlands, where Anne Frank and tens of thousands of others were held before being sent to Auschwitz, was run almost entirely by Dutch authorities and Dutch military police, not German soldiers.
Bram adds a really chilling, haunting anecdote to this segment. Bram mentions a previous interview he conducted with one of the few living survivors of Westerbork. The survivor described the surreal, deeply deceptive nature of the camp.
The psychological warfare of how that camp was structured is just astounding. It wasn't just barbed wire and guard dogs.
No, it had a fully functioning, state-of-the-art hospital. It had a children's creche. It even had a cabaret theater where inmates put on performances.
Why would they build a theater in a transit camp designed for genocide?
To trick the inmates into complacency. By providing excellent medical care and entertainment, the Dutch authorities created the illusion of permanence and safety. The inmates thought they wouldn't build us a hospital if they were going to kill us.
Right. It kept the panic down.
It prevented uprisings. It kept the logistics running smoothly right up until the exact moment the inmates were loaded onto the cattle cars heading east.
Flipse blames this dark, compliant history on what he calls the Dominees and Koopeleden mentality of the Dutch, the mindset of pastors and merchants.
He sees it as a uniquely toxic mix.
Yeah, religious hypocrisy, where people act pious and moralistic on Sunday, combined with ruthless, amoral capitalist self-interest on Monday, where they will sell anyone out to protect their own wealth and status.
He also extends this historical condemnation to the institutional Christian church as a whole. He heavily criticizes its 2,000-year history of persecuting Jews, referencing centuries of pogroms, and specifically
What is replacement theology?
Replacement theology is the idea that the Christian church has entirely replaced the biblical nation of Israel in God's plan, and that the covenant promises made to the Jews were transferred to Christians.
Okay.
Flipse entirely rejects this. As a dispensationalist, he believes God's covenant with the Jewish people is eternal and unbroken.
Which raises a really fascinating paradox. Flipse is a devout conservative Christian who reads the Bible literally. Is it ironic that he is one of the harshest critics of historical Christianity's actions?
It might seem contradictory, but it aligns perfectly with his framework. He fiercely separates his personal, individual relationship with the God of Israel from the sprawling institutional history of the European church.
Right. He views the institutional church, with its popes, bishops, and political entanglements, as having been corrupted by earthly power.
In his view, the institution drifted away from its biblical roots and turned against the very people he believes God chose. Faith is pure. Human bureaucracy is corrupt.
So, because of this perceived moral rot, historical guilt, and imminent economic collapse in the Netherlands, Flipse details his personal escape plan. And he starts with a cautionary tale about timing and destination.
He recounts the story of the family of the Dutch writer Leon de Winter. In the late 1930s, his family correctly identified the rising threat of fascism in Germany. They saw the warning signs, they realized the building was on fire, they sold their business, and they fled.
They made the exact right decision to leave.
But they made a fatal error in choosing their destination. They chose Amsterdam as their safe haven. They thought they were escaping the storm, but they just moved into the path of the hurricane a few years early.
Flipse uses this to stress that identifying the collapse isn't enough. You have to choose the right destination to build your ark.
So what is his multi-step escape plan?
Well, step one is surprisingly close to home. Despite everything he just said about Europe, he is currently moving his primary residence just a few miles across the border into Germany.
Wait, I have to interject here. Didn't he just spend a significant portion of this interview explaining how Germany is losing hundreds of thousands of jobs, destroying its industrial base with the Green Deal, and collapsing under the weight of open borders? Why on earth would he move there?
I know, it seems like a massive contradiction, but it's a calculated, highly pragmatic micromove. He says that while Germany has profound macro problems on a day-to-day localized level for his specific personal situation, it's much better.
How so?
Well, the gasoline is 30% cheaper than in the Netherlands. There is no predatory Box 3 wealth tax eating into his life savings. Crucially, if you hold crypto and precious metals for over a year, the gains are tax-free. He even prefers the culture, saying the driving etiquette is more polite and less aggressive.
But there is a deeper cultural and historical reason, too, isn't there?
Yes, and it ties back to his views on Israel. He believes that Germany, having perpetrated the Holocaust, learned a profound, soul-deep lesson from World War II. He feels the German political and legal culture today is fiercely, institutionally protective of Israel and far less tolerant of the anti-Semitism he claims is rampant and growing in the Netherlands.
So Germany provides immediate financial relief, tax protection, and a sense of historical alignment.
Exactly.
But that's just step one. That's a temporary bulkhead.
Yeah.
What happens if the European CBDCs roll out or the European economy completely shatters? What is his ultimate plan C?
Plan C is an entirely different world. Plan C is Paraguay. Yes, he has already gone through the legal process and obtained a cedula, a permanent residence permit, in this landlocked South American nation. He describes Paraguay as a place of absolute maximum freedom.
Why Paraguay specifically?
Because it is the antithesis of the European bureaucratic state. There is very little government overreach. There are no digital climate tracking metrics. You can buy a hectare of fertile land for just 5,000 euros.
That's incredibly cheap.
Right. You can build what you want, live exactly as you please, and be left entirely alone. Furthermore, he sees it as a place with strong, authentic community bonds. Because the state doesn't provide a massive welfare net, people actually have to rely on their neighbors.
It is a fascinating, jarring contrast. He's moving to Germany for the immediate comforts of a highly developed, orderly, rule-bound nation that protects his wealth. But he is looking toward a developing South American nation for ultimate, untethered freedom. He's preparing to leave the air-conditioned building entirely and walk out into the jungle.
It really highlights the immense trade-offs of the Paraguay plan. Total freedom sounds incredibly romantic, but it comes with a steep cost.
It reminds me of a story Flipse himself tells in the interview about the women from East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. He spoke to them a few years after reunification, fully expecting them to be overjoyed about their new democratic freedoms.
And what did they actually say?
They were deeply ambivalent. They acknowledged that the new freedoms to travel and speak their minds were wonderful, but they also pointed out exactly what they had gained from the capitalist West: unemployment, street crime, and profound daily economic uncertainty.
Because under the strict authoritarian control of East Germany, their lives were heavily limited, but they were secure.
Exactly. They had guaranteed, albeit menial, jobs. They had state-provided childcare. They had very low street crime because the state monitored everything. When you completely remove government control, you invite the chaos of the free market.
Total freedom usually means zero safety nets.
Right. If you move to Paraguay for absolute freedom and your business fails or you get sick, there is no European welfare program to catch you.
That is a brutal trade-off.
Hmm.
Which leads us to the final paradox of this deep dive. We've spent an hour discussing societal collapse, hyperinflation, world wars, satanic global elites, and fleeing across the world to escape a digital prison.
You would think a person holding these beliefs would be terrified, depressed, and hiding in a basement, paralyzed by fear.
But that's not the reality at all.
No.
Flipse claims to be incredibly happy. He quotes the saying, "A day without laughter is a day not lived." He actually views this era not with dread, but as a deeply fascinating, dynamic time to be alive.
Bram even agrees with him on that, pointing out how incredible it is to have lived through the technological leap from old, clunky Nokia brick phones to modern artificial intelligence.
How does he psychologically reconcile that? Believing the world is controlled by evil forces and heading toward an apocalyptic reset, yet maintaining a cheerful, philanthropic, community-focused demeanor in your daily life.
He grounds it in the biblical command to love thy neighbor as thyself. But his interpretation of that is highly practical. He says you cannot physically help your neighbor if you are drowning.
So you have to secure your own safety first.
Yes. You must build your own ark and stock it with supplies before you have the capacity to pull anyone else out of the water. It's the classic put your own oxygen mask on first philosophy applied to the apocalypse.
And despite his absolute unwavering views, he places a massive emphasis on dialogue.
Yes, he urges people to sit at the table with those they vehemently disagree with. He talks about trying to solve Gordian knots, impossible, tangled societal problems, by actually talking to the other side.
He believes you must respect the humanity of your political opponents, even if you think their ideas are entirely wrong or manipulated by dark forces.
If we look at the psychology of this, it reveals a profound truth about human nature. Having a definitive worldview, even a very dark, apocalyptic one, can actually radically reduce daily anxiety.
That takes a second to wrap your head around. How does believing the world is ending reduce anxiety?
Because anxiety doesn't thrive on bad news. Anxiety thrives on uncertainty. If you don't know why the economy is failing or why wars are breaking out, you panic. It feels like random, chaotic violence. But if you have a grand narrative, whether it's political, economic, or theological, that explains exactly why everything is happening and tells you exactly how it will end, it provides a script.
You know your role in the play.
Exactly. You are the builder of the ark. You know the world is supposed to fall apart. So when you see the news, it confirms your beliefs rather than shattering them. The certainty is the comfort, not the outcome. It gives you a profound sense of control and purpose in a world that feels out of control.
Wow, the certainty is the comfort. What a staggering journey this deep dive has been. We started with the macroeconomic indicators of job losses and energy policy in Germany, traveled through the complex, dark history of the Dutch in World War II, ventured into the theological battlegrounds over Jerusalem and the Book of Revelation, and ended with the practical steps of buying cheap land in Paraguay to escape a programmable digital currency.
And we really want to connect this massive web of ideas back to you, the listener. You might listen to this and reject the conspiracy theories entirely.
Yeah.
You might not subscribe to the religious overtones, the apocalyptic timeline, or the views in the Middle East. But Flipse's core, pragmatic advice to evaluate your personal arc is a valuable thought exercise for anyone living in our current, highly unpredictable, hyper-connected world.
Absolutely. Think about your financial resilience. Are you entirely dependent on a single stream of income in a single currency? Think about your community ties. Who are the people you would actually rely on if the digital grid went down for a week?
Right. Think about your reliance on complex, fragile global supply chains. Building resilience isn't just for doomsday preppers in the woods. It's just good sense in a complex world.
But we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. building on that idea of total freedom in Paraguay versus the safety of Europe.
Flipse praises the absolute freedom and lack of government oversight in places like Paraguay. He sees it as the ultimate escape from European bureaucracy and tracking.
But as he himself noted with the women from East Germany, the sudden removal of government control often invites the chaos of the free market, including rising crime and severe inequality. Total freedom means you are entirely on your own.
So think back to that comfortably air-conditioned room where the building might be on fire.
The question for you to ponder is this. If you had to choose your ideal society right now, knowing the risks of both extremes, what percentage of your personal, untethered freedom are you willing to actively trade away for the guarantee of a comfortable, predictable safety net? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.